When Hassan al-Rashid spoke those 3 words in Arabic at the charity gala, the room fell silent, until the black maid in the corner whispered back, "Wana Aidon," and I as well, and everything he thought he knew about the world shattered. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're ready for a story that will leave you speechless, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow brings another incredible journey you won't want to miss. Today's story? When a billionaire spoke Arabic at an elite gala, only the black maid replied, and everything changed forever. Now let us begin. The crystal chandelier cast fractured rainbows across the marble floor of the Pemberton estate, where New York's elite had gathered for the annual Children's Hope Foundation Gala. Hassan al-Rashid stood near the French doors leading to the terrace, his perfectly tailored Tom Ford tuxedo doing little to ease the familiar weight pressing against his chest, the suffocating loneliness that no amount of wealth could cure. At 38, Hassan commanded a business empire worth $12 billion, yet tonight, surrounded by hundreds of guests, he felt more isolated than ever. They spoke to his money, not to him. They saw his success, not his soul. He sipped his champagne and watched the performance. Senators laughing too loudly at mediocre jokes, socialites air-kissing with the warmth of cold marble, businessmen networking with the precision of predators. "Hassan, darling!" Victoria Pemberton glided toward him, her diamonds catching the light like captured stars. "You simply must meet the ambassador's wife. She's dying to discuss your expansion into the Middle East." Hassan nodded politely, but his attention drifted to the corners of the room where the invisible people worked, the servers weaving between tables, the staff ensuring everything ran seamlessly. His eyes lingered on a woman in a simple black uniform, probably in her early 30s, with warm brown skin and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything while remaining unnoticed by everyone. Layla Williams moved with quiet efficiency through the opulent ballroom, refilling water glasses and clearing plates with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent years being looked through, rather than at. She had learned long ago to make herself small in these spaces, to blend into the expensive wallpaper and ornate furniture until she became just another fixture. But beneath her humble exterior lived a woman of extraordinary depth. A former literature professor from Cairo University who had fled Egypt 5 years ago with nothing but her daughter and a heart full of shattered dreams. Now she cleaned the homes of people who spent more on a single bottle of wine than she made in a month, all while studying for her teaching certification at night and helping her 8-year-old daughter with homework in their tiny Queens apartment. As she worked, Layla listened to the conversations swirling around her, discussions of million-dollar art acquisitions, vacation homes in the Hamptons, and charitable donations that were more about tax write-offs than genuine compassion. She understood more languages than any of them suspected, having grown up in a polyglot household where Arabic, French, English, and Italian flowed as naturally as water. Hassan excused himself from Victoria's introduction attempts and stepped onto the terrace for air. The October evening was crisp and Manhattan twinkled below like fallen stars. He pulled out his phone and stared at a photo of his parents, taken in Damascus 30 years ago, before the world had changed, before his family had scattered like leaves in a storm. "Ya Allah," he whispered to the night sky. "Ain Entami. Where do I belong?" The Arabic words tasted like home and heartbreak simultaneously. He had everything a man could want, yet he felt like a stranger in his own life. Success had built walls around him, and he no longer remembered how to tear them down. Back inside, Layla was clearing glasses near the terrace doors when she heard the faint sound of Arabic carried on the wind. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't heard her mother tongue spoken with such raw emotion in months. Without thinking, she moved closer to the French doors, her heart recognizing something her mind hadn't yet processed. The evening was about to shift in ways neither of them could anticipate. What do you think happens when two people from different worlds share the same language of the heart? Have you ever felt invisible in a crowd of people? Share your thoughts below. I read every comment. Hassan returned from the terrace, the night air still clinging to his skin like a whispered memory. The gala was reaching its crescendo, the moment when wealthy donors would compete to outbid each other for charitable causes, their generosity measured in tax-deductible dollars rather than genuine compassion. Victoria Pemberton clinked her champagne glass with a silver spoon, the crystalline notes cutting through the ballroom's chatter like a blade through silk. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention." The room gradually quieted, conversations dying in waves as 300 of New York's most powerful people turned toward the small stage where a podium draped in white roses awaited. Hassan found himself swept forward by the crowd, positioned near the front despite his preference for shadows. "Tonight," Victoria continued, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "we gather not just to celebrate our success, but to remember those who need our help most. The Children's Hope Foundation has been working tirelessly in refugee camps across the Middle East, and I'm thrilled to announce our newest initiative." Hassan's jaw tightened. Here it comes, he thought. The sanitized version of suffering packaged neatly for consumption by people who would never smell the desperation or taste the dust of displacement. "Before we begin our auction, I'd like to share a video message from some of the children we've helped." Victoria's smile could have powered the chandelier above them. "Fair warning, you might want to prepare your tissues." The lights dimmed, and a massive screen descended from the ceiling. Images flickered to life, a makeshift school in a Syrian refugee camp, children sitting cross-legged on worn carpets, their faces bright despite their circumstances. The camera panned across eager young faces before focusing on a little girl, perhaps 7 years old, with enormous dark eyes and a gap-toothed smile. Hassan's breath caught in his throat. She looked exactly like his cousin Nadia had at that age, the cousin who hadn't made it out of Aleppo. The little girl began to speak, her voice clear and strong despite the camera's poor audio quality. "Marshaba astakai fi Amerika. Ismi Layla. Wa urid an ashkurkum ala musaidatna fi talam al-qira'at wal kitaba." Hello, my friends in America. My name is Layla, and I want to thank you for helping us learn to read and write. The subtitle appeared at the bottom of the screen, but Hassan didn't need the translation. Every word hit him like a physical blow, carrying with it the weight of memories he'd spent years trying to bury. His hands began to tremble. Near the back of the room, Layla Williams had stopped breathing entirely. The serving tray in her hands tilted dangerously as she stared at the screen, watching this child who shared her name speak the language of her heart. The little girl's accent was from Layla's own region of Egypt, the inflection identical to how her own daughter, Nora, had spoken Arabic before they'd arrived in America, and English had slowly taken over. The video continued, showing more children, their resilience both heartbreaking and inspiring. But Hassan could no longer see clearly. The room was spinning, the champagne and caviar suddenly feeling obscene in the face of such innocent hope. "Kandu mithil a malaika sugar," he whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of unshed tears. They were like little angels. The words escaped him before he could stop them, spoken in the Arabic of his childhood prayers, meant only for himself and Allah. But in the profound silence that followed the video's end, his whisper carried further than intended. The room remained frozen in that strange pause between sorrow and relief, where wealthy donors processed genuine emotion before returning to their comfortable distance from suffering. No one understood what Hassan had said. No one except, "Naam, inhum molachika hakan." Dear, yes, they truly are angels. The response came from directly behind him, spoken in a voice soft as prayer but clear as mountain water. Hassan spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. There she was, the woman he'd noticed earlier, the one invisible to everyone else. But now she was looking directly at him, her dark eyes shimmering with tears that mirrored his own. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they stared at each other across the social chasm that separated Billionaire from Maid, recognizing something deeper than language, something that transcended every barrier their world had constructed. The silence that followed was deafening. 300 of the most educated, sophisticated people in Manhattan stood in collective shock, not just because the help had spoken, but because she had revealed a hidden world existing right under their noses. The woman they'd ignored, whose name they'd never bothered to learn, had just demonstrated a fluency and depth that shattered every assumption they'd made about her. Victoria Pemberton's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Senator Morrison's champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a cascade of crystal and expensive wine. The ambassador's wife actually took a step backward, as if Layla's words had physically struck her. But Hassan saw none of this. His entire universe had contracted to the space between himself and this woman who had spoken his language, not just Arabic, but the language of shared grief, of understanding, of recognition. In her eyes, he saw something he hadn't experienced in years, the feeling of being truly seen. Layla's hands shook as she held his gaze. She had broken the cardinal rule of her existence. She had made herself visible. There would be consequences. She would likely lose this job, possibly others. But in this moment, faced with a man who carried the same homesickness in his voice that she felt in her bones, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. "Ana Asifa," she whispered. "I'm sorry." But Hassan shook his head, taking a step closer. "La tatadri abadan ala konik insanan," never apologize for being human. The moment hung between them like a bridge, neither was sure they were brave enough to cross. The spell shattered, like the crystal glass still glittering on the marble floor. Hassan's face went ashen as the weight of what had just transpired crashed over him. 300 pairs of eyes were boring into him, and Layla, dissecting the moment with the clinical precision of socialites who had stumbled upon the year's most scandalous gossip. He could already hear tomorrow's whispered conversations at the club. "Did you see Hassan al-Rashid speaking Arabic with the help? How ethnic of him." "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria's voice cut through the tension like a blade wrapped in silk, "let's give our wonderful staff a round of applause for their excellent service tonight." The applause was thunderous and desperate, a collective exhale that allowed everyone to pretend they hadn't just witnessed something that challenged their carefully constructed worldview. Layla flinched at the sound, understanding its true meaning. Back to your place. Resume being invisible. Hassan's businessman mask snapped back into place with practiced efficiency. He straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and turned away from Layla as if the moment had never happened. The walls he'd built around his heart slammed shut with audible finality. "Forgive me," he said, loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, his voice now carrying the cold polish of boardroom negotiations. "I was momentarily overcome by the video. Quite moving, wasn't it?" But even as he spoke, his hands betrayed him, trembling slightly as he reached for a fresh champagne glass from a passing server. Not Layla. He made sure it wasn't Layla. Senator Morrison clapped him on the shoulder with the hearty enthusiasm of a man grateful for any excuse to move past awkwardness. "Quite understandable, my boy. Children always tug at the heartstrings. That's why we're here, after all, to help the less fortunate." The words hit Hassan like a slap. Less fortunate. As if poverty were simply bad luck, rather than a complex web of circumstances and systems. As if the woman standing 10 feet away, the woman who had just revealed depths of culture and education that rivaled anyone in this room, was somehow inferior because she wore a service uniform instead of designer gowns. Layla forced her hands to steady as she began collecting the abandoned champagne glasses scattered across nearby tables. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a bird desperate to escape its cage. What had she done? In 30 seconds of unguarded emotion, she had potentially destroyed everything she'd worked for. Mrs. Henderson, the head of housekeeping, materialized beside her like a storm cloud. Her whisper was sharp enough to cut glass. What in God's name was that about? Nothing, Layla murmured, not trusting her voice above a whisper. It was nothing. Nothing? Girl, you just spoke some foreign language to one of the most important men in this room. In front of everyone. Mrs. Henderson's eyes darted nervously toward Hassan, who was now deep in conversation with a group of businessmen. Do you have any idea what kind of position you've put us in? Layla's throat closed around the words she wanted to say. How could she explain that? For just a moment, she had felt human again. That hearing her native language spoken with such raw emotion had cracked open something inside her that she'd kept carefully locked away since arriving in America. That she'd responded not as a servant, but as a woman who understood grief in all its languages. "I'm sorry," she whispered instead. "It won't happen again." But even as she spoke the words, her eyes found Hassan across the room. He was laughing at something the ambassador's wife had said, but the sound was hollow, mechanical. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched when he thought no one was looking. He was retreating just as desperately as she was, but into a different kind of cage. Hassan felt her gaze like a physical touch and forced himself not to turn around. He couldn't afford to look at her again, not with half of Manhattan's power brokers watching his every move, analyzing his reactions for signs of weakness, or worse, authenticity. "Hassan, we simply must discuss your thoughts on the Syrian situation," Ambassador Whitfield was saying, his tone carrying the self-satisfied weight of a man who believed his opinions mattered simply because he held them. "I've always said that what these people really need is education, not handouts." These people, Hassan's hand tightened around his champagne flute until he feared it might shatter. Behind the ambassador's shoulder, he could see Layla moving through the crowd with graceful efficiency, and he wondered what degrees hung on the walls of the life she'd left behind, what books had shaped her mind, what dreams had been deferred by circumstances beyond her control. "Absolutely," Hassan heard himself say, the words tasting like ash. "Education is indeed crucial." The conversation continued around him, but Hassan was no longer truly present. Part of him remained suspended in that moment, when Layla's voice had cut through his isolation like a key turning in a long locked door. But he couldn't afford to think about that now. Not here. Not with everything he'd built threatening to crumble under the weight of one honest emotion. Across the room, Layla stacked glasses with mechanical precision while her mind raced. She thought of her daughter Nora, asleep in their small apartment, dreaming in English now because Arabic had become the language of their past. She thought of the teaching position she was working toward, the life she was trying to rebuild brick by careful brick. One moment of authenticity couldn't be allowed to destroy everything. But as she worked, she couldn't stop hearing Hassan's voice, not the polished businessman's tone he wore like armor, but the raw whisper that had escaped him when he thought no one was listening. In that voice, she had heard an echo of her own exile, her own longing for home. The evening pressed on around them, each playing their assigned roles, while the weight of unspoken words grew heavier with every passing moment. They were both retreating, but neither could forget the bridge that had suddenly appeared between their separate worlds, a bridge made of shared language, shared loss, and the dangerous recognition that they were more alike than either of them could afford to admit. The resistance was building, but so was something else, something that couldn't be undone with polite conversation and practiced indifference. The evening was winding down when the first crack of thunder split the Manhattan sky like a gunshot. Hassan stood at the main entrance of the Pemberton estate, watching sheets of rain assault the pavement with the fury of nature unleashed. What had been a crisp October evening had transformed into a tempest that sent even the most determined socialites scurrying for cover. His driver, Miguel, was trapped on the other side of the city. A water main had burst on Fifth Avenue, creating a traffic nightmare that wouldn't clear for hours. Hassan had dismissed his backup car earlier, confident he could catch a ride with one of his business associates. But as he watched the last of the limousines disappear into the stormy night, carrying away his potential saviors, he realized his miscalculation. Hassan! Victoria Pemberton appeared beside him, her usual composure slightly frayed. "You're not seriously thinking of walking in this weather?" "I'll manage," he said, though the rain was now coming down so hard it sounded like applause against the windows. "Don't be ridiculous. You'll catch your death." She glanced around the nearly empty foyer. "Most of the staff have already left, but I'm sure we can arrange something. Layla." Hassan's stomach dropped as he heard the name called out. He turned to see Layla emerging from the coat check area, her service uniform replaced by a simple navy blue dress and a worn but well-maintained coat. She had been preparing to leave herself, but Victoria's imperious tone stopped her mid-step. "Yes, Mrs. Pemberton. Do you still have that reliable little car of yours? Mr. Al-Rashid needs transportation back to the city." The request hung in the air like a challenge. Neither of them had asked for. Hassan opened his mouth to protest. The last thing he needed was to be trapped in a confined space with the woman who had already unsettled his carefully ordered world. But Layla spoke first. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Pemberton, but my car is in the shop. I took the subway tonight." Relief and disappointment warred in Hassan's chest. He was grateful to avoid the awkward intimacy of sharing her car, but something in him had been hoping. "Well then, you'll both just have to wait it out in the library," Victoria declared with the breezy certainty of someone accustomed to solving problems through delegation. "The groundskeeper says this storm should pass within the hour. I'd stay and chat, but Richard is waiting for me at home, and you know how he gets when his dinner is delayed." Before either of them could object, Victoria had disappeared into the night, leaving Hassan and Layla standing in the marble foyer like two survivors of a shipwreck. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain against the windows. "You don't have to wait with me," Hassan said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm sure you're eager to get home to your family." "My daughter is at a sleepover tonight," Layla replied, then immediately regretted sharing the personal detail. "But you're right, I should try to catch the last train before." A flash of lightning illuminated the windows, followed immediately by thunder so loud it rattled the crystal chandelier above them. As if summoned by the storm's fury, the lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging them into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, casting everything in an eerie amber glow that made the grand foyer feel like a mausoleum. In the distance they could hear Victoria's voice calling out reassurances to whatever guests remained, but her words were swallowed by the storm's roar. "The backup generator will restore full power soon," Hassan said, more to fill the silence than because he believed it mattered. Layla nodded, then realized he might not be able to see the gesture in the dim light. "The library Mrs. Pemberton mentioned, do you know where it is?" "Follow me." They walked through the darkened hallways in silence, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Hassan led them to a set of heavy oak doors that opened into a room that was pure sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather armchairs arranged around a fireplace, Persian rugs that muffled their steps. Battery-powered emergency lanterns had automatically activated, casting dancing shadows across the spines of thousands of books. Hassan moved to one of the tall windows that looked out over the estate's gardens. The storm had transformed the manicured landscape into something wild and primitive, trees bending like supplicants before the wind's fury. "It's beautiful," Layla said softly, moving to stand beside him. He glanced at her, surprised by the observation. In the amber light, her profile was striking, strong jawline, intelligent eyes, the kind of quiet dignity that came not from breeding, but from character. "You're not afraid of storms?" "I grew up in Cairo. Different storms, but storms nonetheless." She paused, then added, "Besides, fear is a luxury I can't afford." The comment hung between them, loaded with implications Hassan didn't dare explore. Instead, he turned away from the window and found himself drawn to the nearest bookshelf. His fingers traced the spines until he found what he was looking for, a worn copy of Naguib Mahfouz's Children of Gebelawi. "I haven't read that in years," Layla said, appearing beside him. "It was banned in Egypt for most of my childhood." Hassan's hand stilled on the book's spine. "You know Mahfouz?" "I wrote my master's thesis on his use of allegory as social commentary." The words escaped before she could stop them, and she immediately tensed, waiting for the inevitable questions about how a maid could have a master's degree. But Hassan didn't ask those questions. Instead, he pulled the book from the shelf and held it reverently. "Cairo Trilogy changed my life. I read it during my first year at Harvard when I was struggling with questions of identity and belonging." "The tension between tradition and modernity," Layla murmured. "Between who we were and who we're becoming." "Exactly." He turned to face her fully, his businessman's mask slipping without him realizing it. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living in two different worlds, and I don't fully belong in either." The admission surprised them both. In the amber glow of the emergency lighting, surrounded by the wisdom of ages and the fury of the storm outside, something had shifted. The barriers that separated them, class, race, circumstance, seemed less solid than they had an hour ago. "I know that feeling," Layla said quietly. "Though I suspect our two worlds are very different." "Are they?" Hassan asked, and for the first time since they'd met, his voice carried no polish, no pretense, only genuine curiosity. "Or are we both just trying to find our way home?" Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the library, something fragile and dangerous was beginning to bloom, a recognition that perhaps they weren't as different as the world insisted they must be. The silence that followed Hassan's question stretched like a held breath. Layla moved away from him, her fingers trailing along the book spines as if seeking answers in their leather-bound wisdom. The storm outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself was waiting for her response. "Home," she repeated softly, the word carrying weight that could sink ships. "I used to think I knew what that meant." Hassan remained perfectly still, sensing that she stood at the edge of a precipice, and one wrong word from him could send her tumbling back into silence. "I had a home once," Layla continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "A beautiful apartment overlooking the Nile. My husband was a journalist, brave, idealistic, the kind of man who believed words could change the world." She pulled a slim volume of poetry from the shelf. Mahmoud Darwish. He wrote about freedom the way other men write love letters. Hassan's chest tightened. The past tense in her voice carried the weight of tragedy. Ahmad believed in truth, in justice, in speaking for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Layla opened the poetry book, but Hassan suspected she wasn't reading the words, she was seeing memories. He wrote an exposé about government corruption, about money meant for refugees being diverted to private accounts. She turned a page she wasn't reading. 3 days after the article was published, they came for him. Hassan closed his eyes, understanding flooding through him like ice water. He'd heard similar stories too many times, journalists who asked the wrong questions, activists who spoke inconvenient truths, ordinary people who refused to look the other way. They said it was a car accident. Layla's voice cracked like glass under pressure. Single vehicle collision on a road. Ahmed had driven safely for 10 years, but I saw his notes, hidden in our bedroom wall. He knew they were coming. He'd written me a letter, told me to take Nora and run if anything happened to him. She closed the poetry book with a soft thud that sounded like a coffin lid. So I ran, sold everything we owned, used every contact Ahmad had made, and got us visas to America. I arrived here with an 8-year-old daughter who cried herself to sleep every night asking for her baba, and degrees that apparently mean nothing if you're a refugee who doesn't speak English perfectly. Hassan felt something break open inside his chest. Layla. No, she said sharply, then softened her tone. I don't need pity. I need work. I need to build a new life for my daughter. I need to become someone who belongs here, not someone who's always looking over her shoulder. She moved to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass like tears. Every morning I wake up and choose to be grateful instead of bitter. Grateful that we're alive, that Nora is safe, that I can work even if it's not the work I trained for. But some nights, she paused, some nights I dream I'm still in Cairo, and Ahmad is reading to me from his latest article, and everything is still possible. Hassan approached slowly, as if she were a wild creature that might bolt. How long has it been? 5 years next month. She turned to face him, and in the amber light, he could see the careful armor she wore every day, not just against prejudice, but against her own grief. Nora barely remembers him now. Sometimes I catch her trying to remember his voice, and I realize I'm losing it too. The admission broke something in Hassan's carefully constructed facade. Without thinking, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, scrolling to the photo he'd been looking at earlier on the terrace. This was my family, he said quietly, showing her the image of a young couple standing in front of a fountain in Damascus. My parents, Khalil and Yasmin al-Rashid, taken 6 months before the bombing that killed them both. Layla's breath caught as she looked at the photo. The man had Hassan's eyes, the woman his stubborn chin. They looked so young, so hopeful, their arms wrapped around each other as if nothing could ever tear them apart. I was at Harvard when it happened, Hassan continued, his voice steady but hollow. Studying business, planning to come home and help rebuild Syria's economy. My parents were so proud, their son, the first in our family to attend university in America. He took the phone back, staring at the image as if memorizing every pixel. I got the call at 3 in the morning, a neighbor who'd survived the blast. My parents had been hosting a dinner party for other intellectuals, doctors, teachers, writers, people who believed education and discourse could heal their country's wounds. Hassan, Layla whispered, recognizing the shape of his grief because it matched her own. 17 people died that night. My mother was found still holding my father's hand. His voice cracked like ice over water. I never got to say goodbye. Never got to tell them that their dreams for me came true, but also turned into a nightmare. He looked up at her, and she saw the truth he'd been hiding behind his success. Every dollar I've made, every deal I've closed, every board I sit on, it's all built on the foundation of their deaths. I became wealthy by staying away from the place that killed them, by speaking English instead of Arabic, by becoming exactly what they wanted me to be but in a world they'll never see. Layla reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing his hand where it gripped the phone. The touch was electric, not with romance but with recognition. 2 souls who had lost their true homes and were trying to build new ones from the ashes of what came before. We're both ghosts, she said softly, living in the shadows of who we used to be. Hassan turned his hand palm up, capturing her fingers in his. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt like myself again. When you answered me in Arabic, when you understood what I was really saying." "I felt it too," she admitted. "Like coming up for air after drowning for 5 years." Outside, the storm began to calm, but inside the library, two people stood at the edge of something that could either heal them or destroy everything they'd worked to build. The truth was out now. Floating between them like a bridge made of shared sorrow and unexpected hope. Neither of them was ready to cross it yet, but they could no longer pretend it didn't exist. The storm outside had gentled to a steady patter against the windows, transforming from nature's fury into something almost melodic. Hassan and Layla remained by the bookshelf, their hands still connected by the gossamer thread of shared understanding, neither willing to break the spell that had settled over them. "Your daughter?" Hassan said softly. "Nora. Tell me about her." Layla's face transformed at the mention of her child, grief giving way to something luminous and fierce. "She's remarkable. 8 years old but wise as an ancient tree. She translates for me when my English fails, helps our elderly neighbor Mrs. Chen with her groceries, and still believes she can become an astronaut doctor-teacher when she grows up." "All three at once?" Hassan's lips curved into the first genuine smile he'd worn all evening. "According to her, there's no rule against it." Layla's laugh was like sunlight breaking through clouds. "She says if you're going to dream, you might as well dream big. I wonder where she gets that from." "Definitely not from her brilliant professor mother who fled across an ocean to build a new life from nothing," Hassan said dryly. The teasing note in his voice caught them both off guard. When was the last time either of them had engaged in gentle banter? When had their conversations last included laughter instead of carefully measured business speak or polite service responses? Layla moved to one of the leather armchairs by the fireplace, suddenly exhausted by the weight of the evening's revelations. Hassan hesitated for a moment, then settled into the chair across from her, the coffee table between them creating a safe distance that somehow felt less necessary than before. "What was Ahmed like?" he asked gently, "when he wasn't being brave and idealistic?" Layla's eyes grew distant, but not with pain this time, with fondness. "He was terrible at cooking, but insisted on trying every Friday night. Our kitchen looked like a war zone by the time he finished making what he called experimental cuisine." She shook her head, smiling at the memory. "Nora and I learned to keep backup bread hidden in case his experiments were less than successful." "My mother was the same way," Hassan found himself saying. "She could perform complex surgeries. She was a pediatric cardiologist, but ask her to make rice, and somehow she'd burn it every time. My father did all the cooking, and she'd sit at the kitchen counter reading medical journals and offering completely unhelpful suggestions." "Like what?" "Add more salt, Habibi. Maybe it needs to cook longer. Are you sure you're following the recipe?" Hassan's imitation of his mother's voice was so spot on that Layla burst into laughter. Meanwhile, she once operated for 14 hours straight to repair a baby's heart defect without taking a single break. Complex cardiac surgery, flawless. Basic rice preparation, impossible. Layla giggled, and the sound was like music in the book-lined sanctuary. "Exactly. Ahmad sounds like he would have fit right into our family chaos." The words hung in the air, and they both realized what he'd said. Our family would have, the conditional tense that acknowledged both their losses and the impossible bridge that connected them. Hassan cleared his throat, suddenly self-conscious. "I haven't talked about them like this in years. My parents. Usually when people ask about family, I give some sanitized version about losing them in the conflict and change the subject." "It's easier that way," Layla nodded. "People don't know what to do with real grief. They want the condensed version, sad but not too sad, tragic but ultimately inspiring. They don't want to hear about burnt rice or experimental cuisine, or the way Ahmad used to sing off-key in the shower every morning. Or how my father would sneak baklava from the kitchen before dinner, and my mother would pretend not to notice even though she always made extra just for him. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in memories that no longer felt like weapons turned against them. In this amber-lit library, surrounded by the stories of others, their own stories felt less like burdens and more like treasures they'd been afraid to share. "Can I ask you something?" Layla said finally. "Anything. Tonight at the gala, when you spoke Arabic, what made you do it? You seemed so guarded before that moment." Hassan leaned back in his chair, considering, "I spend my days speaking the language of profit margins and market shares. I've trained myself to think in English, dream in English, even pray in English sometimes. But when I saw that little girl on the screen," he paused, searching for words that could capture the feeling. "It was like hearing my own heart speak after years of silence. That child's courage, her hope despite everything she'd lost, it reminded me of who I used to be before I learned to hide behind success. And I reminded you that someone was listening," Layla said quietly. "You reminded me that I wasn't alone." Hassan met her eyes across the coffee table. "For the first time in years, I felt like I was having a conversation instead of giving a performance." Layla reached for a book from the side table, a collection of Rumi's poetry. She opened it randomly and read softly. "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about." Hassan finished the quote from memory. Their eyes met again, and something shifted. The careful distance they'd maintained, the social barriers that had seemed insurmountable just hours ago, felt suddenly thin as paper. They were no longer billionaire and maid, successful immigrant and struggling refugee. They were simply two people who had found each other in a field beyond the world's expectations. "Hassan," Layla said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he replied, though neither of them had spoken the words that hung between them like a promise and a threat. In the distance, they heard the hum of electricity returning as the power grid restored itself. The emergency lighting would soon give way to the harsh fluorescent reality of the regular world. Their sanctuary was temporary, this moment borrowed from time and circumstance. But for now, in the gentle patter of rain and the warm glow of amber light, two souls had found exactly what Rumi had promised. A field where their shared humanity mattered more than the labels the world had assigned them. Neither of them was ready to name what was blooming between them, but they could no longer deny that something precious and dangerous had taken root. Have you ever met someone who understood a part of you that you thought was invisible? How do you think Hassan and Layla will handle this growing connection when the real world intrudes? Share your thoughts. I love reading about your own experiences with unexpected connections. The fluorescent lights blazed to life with the merciless efficiency of reality returning. Hassan and Layla blinked in the sudden brightness, the warm amber glow of their sanctuary replaced by harsh white light that made everything look stark and clinical. The spell was broken so abruptly that they both felt disoriented, like sleepers yanked from a beautiful dream. "Power's back." Victoria Pemberton's voice echoed through the hallways, followed by the sharp click of her heels on marble. "Hassan, darling, are you still here?" Hassan shot to his feet as if he'd been caught committing a crime. The movement was so sudden, so panicked, that Layla flinched as though he'd struck her. In the space of a heartbeat, she watched him transform back into the polished businessman she'd first observed, spine straight, expression carefully neutral, every trace of vulnerability buried beneath layers of practiced composure. "We should," Hassan began, but stopped himself, unsure what they should do. What was the protocol for this? How did a billionaire explain being found in intimate conversation with the help? Footsteps approached the library doors. Multiple sets, Victoria's staccato heels, the heavy tread of men's dress shoes, the soft rustle of expensive evening wear. Hassan's face went pale as he recognized the voices Senator Morrison, Ambassador Whitfield, and worse, Richard Pemberton, Victoria's husband and the chairman of Hassan's largest client's board of directors. The library was always the best place to wait out storms, Victoria was saying. Hassan's probably been reading this whole time. You know how these intellectual types are. Laughter. Masculine, confident laughter that belonged to men who had never questioned their right to take up space in any room they entered. Hassan looked at Layla and she saw something die in his eyes. The man who had shared memories of his parents, who had spoken Arabic with tears in his voice, who had quoted Rumi like a prayer, that man was disappearing before her eyes, replaced by someone who calculated social costs in real time. "You need to go," he said quietly, his voice stripped of all the warmth it had held moments before. "What?" Layla's voice was barely a whisper. "The service entrance. Use the back hallway. They can't, we can't." Hassan ran his hands through his hair, destroying the perfect styling. This was a mistake. The words hit Layla like physical blows. A mistake. Not a moment of connection, not a recognition of shared humanity, not the first real conversation either of them had experienced in years. A mistake. "Of course," she said, her voice steady despite the way her world was crumbling. "How silly of me to think." The library doors opened before she could finish the sentence. "Hassan?" Victoria swept in like a force of nature, followed by the three men. "There you are. We were beginning to worry that you'd been swept away by the storm." Hassan's smile was magazine perfect. "Just enjoying your excellent library collection, Victoria. Quite an impressive first edition of—" He stopped mid-sentence because Richard Pemberton had noticed Layla. "I'm sorry," Richard said, his tone carrying the particular chill that wealthy men reserved for people they considered beneath their notice. "I wasn't aware staff were still on the premises." The silence that followed was excruciating. Layla stood frozen by the bookshelf, still holding the Rumi collection, while Hassan faced the most important social test of his carefully constructed American life. Say the wrong thing, show too much familiarity with the help, and his reputation in this circle could be damaged beyond repair. "She was just—" Hassan began, then stopped. Layla watched his face, saw the moment he made his choice. She was just finishing her duties. Her duties, as if the last hour had never happened, as if she were indeed just another invisible servant who had wandered into his presence by accident. "Well, we certainly don't want to keep you from getting home safely," Senator Morrison said to Layla, his tone dripping with the condescending kindness that powerful men used when they wanted to seem benevolent. "I'm sure you have a family waiting." "Yes, sir," Layla managed, her voice barely audible. She placed the book back on the shelf with hands that trembled only slightly. "I was just leaving." She moved toward the door, but Ambassador Whitfield stepped slightly into her path, not blocking her deliberately, but asserting the casual privilege of someone who never considered that others might need space to pass. "Layla, isn't it?" His smile was shark-like. "I have to say, that was quite the display earlier this evening. Very educational." The word hung in the air like a threat. Layla felt every eye in the room on her, felt the weight of being assessed, categorized, judged. She was no longer a woman who had shared grief and poetry with someone who understood her loss. She was a curiosity, an oddity, a servant who had forgotten her place. "I apologize if I caused any disturbance," she said, the words cutting her throat like glass. "Oh, no disturbance at all," Richard Pemberton said smoothly. "Just surprising to discover such hidden depths among the staff. Makes one wonder what other surprises might be lurking below stairs." Hassan remained silent through this exchange. Silent while they dissected her like a specimen. Silent while they reduced her education, her pain, her entire existence to an amusing anecdote. Silent while the woman who had made him feel human again was humiliated in front of him. Layla looked at him one last time, hoping to see some flicker of the man she had connected with, some sign that their conversation had meant something. But Hassan was studying his shoes with the intensity of someone who had found something fascinating in the carpet pattern. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said quietly, and walked out of the library with her head held high. Hassan listened to her footsteps fade down the hallway and felt something essential tear inside his chest. But when Richard Pemberton clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Now then, shall we discuss that Syrian infrastructure deal?" Hassan smiled and nodded like the successful businessman he had worked so hard to become. In the hallway, Layla pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes, letting the tears she had held back finally fall. She had been foolish to think that shared poetry and mutual grief could bridge the chasm between their worlds. She had forgotten the most important lesson of her 5 years in America: hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Behind the library doors, Hassan discussed profit margins and investment opportunities while his heart bled for the woman he had just betrayed. Both of them had learned a brutal truth tonight. Some bridges were too fragile to bear the weight of the real world, and some connections were too dangerous to survive the light of day. The bond that had bloomed between them in the amber-lit sanctuary lay shattered on the marble floor, and neither of them was sure it could ever be repaired. 3 days passed like winter months. Hassan sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building, staring out at the Manhattan skyline that usually filled him with pride. Today, the city looked gray and lifeless, matching the hollow ache that had taken residence in his chest since the night of the gala. He hadn't slept properly in 72 hours. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Layla's face in that final moment, the way hope had died in her eyes when he chose silence over courage. His assistant had buzzed him twice about the Syrian infrastructure meeting, but Hassan couldn't bring himself to care about profit margins and development contracts. The numbers on his screen blurred together meaninglessly. He kept hearing Ambassador Whitfield's voice, "Makes one wonder what other surprises might be lurking below stairs." He kept seeing himself standing there like a coward while they turned Layla into a curiosity, an oddity, a thing to be examined and dismissed. The Rumi book lay open on his desk. He'd bought it that morning, driven by some masochistic need to torture himself with the memory of her voice reading poetry in the amber light. "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." But he had abandoned her in that field, left her to face the wolves alone while he protected his reputation. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria Pemberton. "Hassan darling, Richard was so impressed with how you handled that awkward situation with the staff. Shall we discuss the charity board position over lunch?" Hassan stared at the message until the words lost all meaning. How you handled that awkward situation. Was that what Layla had become? An awkward situation that he had handled well by betraying everything real that had passed between them. He thought of his parents, of their commitment to justice and truth even when it cost them everything. What would they think of the man he had become? What would they say about their son who had chosen social acceptance over human decency? The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had become exactly the kind of person his parents had fought against, someone who valued status over substance, who measured worth by wealth instead of character. In protecting his position in a world that didn't deserve him, he had lost himself completely. Across the city in Queens, Layla sat at her kitchen table grading papers for the ESL class she taught 3 nights a week at the community center. The red pen shook in her hand as she tried to focus on sentence structure and grammar, but the words kept blurring together. She hadn't told anyone about what happened at the gala, not Mrs. Chen next door, not her study group, not even her daughter who had called excitedly from her sleepover to ask how fancy rich people acted at parties. What would she say? That for one magical hour she had felt like herself again, that she had connected with someone who understood her grief, her displacement, her dreams, that she had been foolish enough to think shared poetry could overcome the reality of class and race and circumstance? Nora bounded through the front door, backpack trailing behind her like a loyal dog. "Mama, Mrs. Rodriguez said I can help her teach the little kids Arabic if I practice more at home. Can we speak Arabic at dinner tonight, please?" Layla's heart clenched. For months, Nora had been pulling away from her heritage, embarrassed by her mother's accent, frustrated by the complexity of maintaining two languages, but something had shifted. "Why the sudden interest, Habibti?" Layla asked, setting down her red pen. "Because Maria's mom said that speaking lots of languages makes you smarter, and also," Nora climbed into her mother's lap, despite being almost too big for it. "I dreamed about Baba last night. He was speaking Arabic, and I understood everything he said. When I woke up, I was sad because I thought I was forgetting him." Tears burned behind Layla's eyes. "What did he say in the dream?" "He said that our words are bridges, Mama. That they connect us to people we love even when they're far away." Nora looked up at her mother with Ahmad's eyes. "I don't want to lose the bridges to Baba." "Our words are bridges." Layla thought of Hassan in the library, the way his face had transformed when she responded in Arabic, the recognition that had passed between them like electricity. She thought of how he had whispered about belonging, about feeling like a stranger in his own life. And then she thought of how quickly he had severed that bridge when it became inconvenient. But what if she was being as cowardly as he was? What if her silence was just another form of self-protection? Ahmad had died for believing that truth mattered more than safety. Was she honoring his memory by hiding, or was she betraying everything he had taught her about courage? Her phone sat on the counter, silent and accusatory. She had Hassan's business card. Victoria had given it to all the staff in case of emergencies. For 3 days, she had stared at those numbers, telling herself that reaching out would be pathetic, desperate, another mistake in a life that couldn't afford many more. But Nora's words echoed in her mind. Our words are bridges. Maybe the bridge between her and Hassan was damaged, maybe it couldn't bear the weight of their different worlds. But maybe, just maybe, it deserved the chance to be tested properly. Maybe courage wasn't about protecting yourself from disappointment. Maybe it was about reaching across impossible distances and hoping someone would reach back. Hassan's phone rang just as he was packing up to leave the office, unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. Hassan al-Rashid. Silence. Then, so quietly he almost missed it. Urid an atother, I want to apologize. His hand tightened on the phone until his knuckles went white. Layla, I shouldn't have called. This was, don't hang up. The words came out rougher than he intended, desperate. Please don't hang up. Silence stretched between them across the city, across the chasm of class and circumstance, across 3 days of regret and self-recrimination. Two people standing at the edge of a bridge they had built together and then watched burn, wondering if it could be rebuilt from ash and hope. I'm sorry, Hassan said finally. The words inadequate but necessary. I'm so sorry, Layla. What I did, what I didn't do. I know, she whispered. I know you are. The choice hung between them like a challenge, retreat into safety or step forward into the unknown. Choose pride or choose truth. Choose the comfortable lie of separation or the dangerous possibility of connection. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, but neither hung up either. In that silence, a bridge began to rebuild itself, one word at a time. The following Saturday, Hassan stood outside the Queen's Community Center at exactly 7 p.m., his hands trembling as much from nerves as from the October chill. He had spent the week in sleepless research, tracking down every detail about Layla's life that public records could reveal. Her teaching schedule, her daughter's school, the small apartment where they had built their new world from the ashes of the old. He wasn't stalking, he was preparing, because when you were about to risk everything on a single moment of truth, you didn't leave anything to chance. Through the center's windows, he could see Layla at the front of a classroom, animated and alive in a way he had never witnessed at the Pemberton estate. She was teaching Arabic to a dozen adult students, immigrants like herself, refugees seeking to preserve their children's heritage, Americans hungry to understand their neighbors' stories. Her voice carried through the glass, confident and warm, every gesture painting pictures in the air. Hassan watched her and realized he was seeing the woman she had been before grief and circumstances had forced her into hiding. This was Professor Layla Williams, not the invisible maid who served champagne to people who didn't bother to learn her name. The class ended at 7:30. Hassan waited as students filed out, chatting in mixed languages, Arabic blending with Spanish, English, and what sounded like Mandarin. A united nations of hope learning to speak each other's truths. Layla emerged last, her bag slung over her shoulder, car keys already in her hand. She stopped breathing when she saw him. Hassan. His name on her lips was part surprise, part question, part prayer. "I asked myself what a Hamad would do," he said, without preamble, stepping closer. If he faced a choice between safety and truth, between fitting in and standing up, what would he choose? Layla's eyes filled with tears. "Hassan, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." He pulled something from his jacket pocket, a folded newspaper clipping, worn soft from handling. "This was your husband's last article. I found it online, translated it myself. He wrote about moral courage, about the responsibility that comes with privilege." Her hands shook as she recognized Ahmad's words in Hassan's careful translation. "You read his work?" "Every piece I could find." "And you know what I realized?" Hassan stepped closer, close enough that she could see the determination burning in his dark eyes. "He was braver than I've ever been. He chose truth over safety every single day. And you," his voice cracked, "you're doing the same thing. Teaching, building bridges, raising a daughter who believes she can be an astronaut doctor-teacher." "Hassan, let me finish. Please." He took a shaking breath. 3 days ago, I had a choice. I could stand with you or protect myself. I chose cowardice. But Ahmad's words, your courage, they've been haunting me, so I'm here to make a different choice. Before Layla could respond, Hassan turned toward the community center and raised his voice, speaking clearly in Arabic. "Read an akula hakiga, a hubbuk, Layla. What urid an yarif alalam kullo min enti hakan that sputstroth. I love you, Layla. And I want the whole world to know who you really are." The words echoed off the building's facade, carrying across the quiet street. A few remaining students turned to stare, and Layla saw Mrs. Rodriguez from the center step out to listen. But Hassan wasn't finished. "You are Dr. Layla Williams," he continued in English, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Former professor of literature at Cairo University, widow of journalist Ahmad Williams, a man who died for believing that truth matters more than convenience. Mother to Nora, who inherits her father's courage and her mother's brilliance." He turned back to Layla, and she saw that he was crying openly now, all pretense stripped away. "You are not invisible. You are not a mistake. You are not someone to be ashamed of knowing. You are the bravest person I have ever met, and I love you." The declaration hung in the evening air like a bridge spanning impossible distances. Layla stared at him, seeing not the polished businessman from the gala, but the man who had quoted Rumi in an amber-lit library, who had shared his parents' memory with a stranger, who had recognized her grief because it matched his own. "The whole world is watching," she whispered, gesturing to the small crowd that had gathered. "Let them watch," Hassan said fiercely. "Let them see what it looks like when someone stops hiding behind walls and chooses love instead." Layla thought of Ahmad, of his articles about moral courage. She thought of Nora, who believed in dreaming big and building bridges with words. She thought of the little girl in the video whose hope had started this whole journey. And then she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Ahaybak Aidan Hassan. Wa ana lesta khaifa min an yarif al-alam. I love you too, Hassan, and I'm not afraid for the world to know." When he kissed her, it tasted like homecoming and new beginnings, like the answer to questions they had both been afraid to ask. Around them, the small crowd broke into applause, Mrs. Rodriguez wiping her eyes, the remaining students grinning like they had witnessed something magical. Because they had. 6 months later, Hassan al-Rashid stood at another podium, but this time the words he spoke were entirely his own. The Al-Rashid Foundation for Refugee Education had just opened its first learning center, and Dr. Layla Williams, his wife, his partner, his bridge to the person he was meant to be, was cutting the ribbon with their 8-year-old daughter Nora by her side. "Education is the greatest bridge we can build," Hassan told the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had stopped hiding from himself. "And love, true recognition of each other's humanity, is what makes those bridges strong enough to span any distance." In the audience, he spotted Victoria Pemberton sitting next to Senator Morrison, both of them applauding politely. They had cut him from their social circles after he resigned from several boards to focus on humanitarian work, but Hassan had discovered something profound. He didn't miss being accepted by people who couldn't see past their own prejudices. Layla joined him at the podium, and together they watched as the first students, refugees, immigrants, and local residents, eager to learn from each other, streamed into the center that would become their bridge to new possibilities. "Ready for our next adventure, Dr. Al-Rashid?" Hassan murmured, using her new married name for the first time in public. "Always," she whispered back in Arabic, then repeated it in English for everyone to hear, "always." They had learned that some bridges were worth building, even when the world insisted they were impossible, especially then. And as the sun set over Queens, two people who had once felt like strangers in their own lives stood hand in hand, no longer hiding from who they were or apologizing for who they loved. They had found their field beyond right doing and wrongdoing, and they would meet there again and again for the rest of their lives. What barriers in your own life are you ready to tear down for love? Have you ever had to choose between fitting in and standing up for what matters? Share your story of courage in the comments. Your words might be the bridge someone else needs to cross.
Hassan and Layla's story reminds us that true love isn't just about finding someone who completes you. It's about finding someone who gives you the courage to be your most authentic self even when the world tells you to hide. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to be invisible anymore. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Thank you for watching this story to the end.